Welcome back to Bunny Banter, the first and only podcast for everything Killer Bunnies. I'm your host, Matt, here with co-host Mikey.
Hello.
And as a guest today, we have our experts passive researcher, Frank.
Yeah, sure. That's me.
What are we talking about today, Mikey?
Today we are talking about passivity or passive strats, I guess. Part of the passivity meta, but passive strats.
Yes, Article 11 of the Bunny Banter Catechism, if you're keeping track. So yeah, passive strategy is often viewed as the counterintuitive one or the non-viable one. It's just because it was discovered within the past year or two, probably 2 years, and definitely has been experimented with more recently. At our tabletop club, for a while there, the meta was pretty much entirely passive, which was a very interesting state to be in, although now it's transitioning away from that. But eventually it might transition back to that, so it's always an interesting thing to watch. Passive strategy is, of course, is recognized by playing low value cards in order to not be a target. And usually passive players will be quite generous in their trades and are kind of nice to everyone, so that everyone will be nice back to them. Nice back to them is the theory. In some sense, it's the counter to neutral strategy, because since neutral players are fair, if you are nice to a neutral player, they should be nice back, is the idea. In theory. Okay, so let's get right into the discussion here with talking about one of the strategies. We have one of the largest categories of passive strategies that I have here is what I call the attrition strategy, which is an economic strategy in which the player purposefully ruins his economy in hopes opponents will target him less in the future. So this can take many different forms. Let's just get right into it and start with the first one here. I like to call it alms from the poor, as opposed to alms for the poor. Yeah, alms from the poor. And it's an attrition strategy in which the player gives away all that he has. So, for example, if somebody needs a bunny, you just give it away. You know, if somebody needs a bunny, you just give it away. Maybe they'll give you a bunny back in the future. Who knows? They might not. What are your thoughts on that, Mikey?
It's pretty effective. I've recently, I haven't played Killer Bunnies that much anymore. Terrible thing.
Yeah, Mikey's been busy.
I have been busy. But it's pretty effective. I like it. It's especially fun when you're playing with people who are new. And they're like, what's going on? Or if you're playing with only people who have traditionally ever played with aggressive players. Or it's just fun to do in general because people target you less. Then sometimes you can have battles to see who can give away the most stuff. That's fun. If you just keep giving stuff to other passive players, it's like you each just give each other a whole bunch of crap, and it's really fun. So
That's about right. What do you think, Frank?
Uh, well, it all depends on what I actually have. I can only really give away things if I actually have enough bunnies. But I tend to like to do it. Especially if someone missed out on something from like a terrible misfortune. Or
Mm-hmm.
they need it for something.
Yeah, it's very common to see whenever another player is in need. So it will very often be used giving things to neutral players usually, because let's assume for one moment that all of the categories of strategies are present. Usually the aggressive player will target the neutral player because he's a threat, and then the passive player will support the neutral player by giving him whatever he needs to be able to handle that threat, and then the neutral player will often be nice to the passive player in return. And if you notice the math there, aggressive targeted neutral, neutral received something from passive, passive received it back from neutral, the winner there is the passive player, because the passive player wasn't targeted initially, but didn't actually lose anything. So some of the biggest benefits from playing passive is that very few players will actually target you, or if they do so, it will quite often result in a large retaliation from the players that you've been nice to. So you don't even have to retaliate for yourself. If you've been nice to a player, they'll often retaliate for you. In which case they get blamed for the retaliation, get the counter retaliation. so, so you can see how these types of strategies can quickly affect. They quickly counter, and counter is perhaps not the correct word, but they counter the neutral strategy, and it's very interesting to see how that actually works, because you're not actually harming the neutral players directly. You're just taking advantage of them isn't even the right word, but that's basically what you're doing. Anything else we want to say about alms from the port before we move on to the next attrition strategy here, because we have quite a few of them.
There's a strange noise on the end of this, at least on my end.
Okay,
Yeah, I'm hearing it too.
it might be
It's
from
like
me then.
Is
Is it still there? It's still there?
no, it just comes and goes.
Okay. I think it might be the Discord, because I noticed my connection dropped there for a second. So hopefully it doesn't appear on the recording.
Well, for those of you who are listening to the recording, if you can't hear the noise, perhaps we're crazy.
Perhaps. But yes, I am seeing some connection issues with Discord, but hopefully it resolves itself. Hopefully. Let me do that. Maybe that'll help. Okay. Moving on here. The next, I have these in alphabetical order, not necessarily order of what would be intuitive. Next thing I have here I call Blessed Are the Poor, which is similar, except it's attrition in which the player purposefully accepts a bad trade. So if you remember from the aggressive strategy a couple episodes ago, we talked about false trading. And that's when an aggressive player trades something that they have full intention of either stealing back or making the player lose it. So it's the player thinks they're getting a good deal, but in reality, the aggressive player is highly favored in the trade. Blessed Are the Poor is a strategy in which the passive player, knowing that it's a false trade, or at least a bad trade, takes the trade anyways. And then the hope is that the other players in the game will consider the use of the false trade very aggressive and will thus target that aggressive player while you're seen as the victim. It's very important that you don't actually claim to be the victim, otherwise players usually don't like it when you claim to be targeted excessively. But if they subconsciously view you as the victim, you're in really good shape at that position is the idea. Have you ever seen this one, Frank? Or tried to use it?
I can't say that I remember a specific situation.
Okay. I think I've seen it once, and I didn't realize it at the time, but it was a game with Tyler, and I did a minor false trade against him. I can't remember if I purposely did it or if it was on subconscious, because I've been subconsciously false trading recently, which is a scary thought. But I did the false trade against him one way or another, and he knew it was a false trade, but he told me afterwards that he took it intentionally.
Oh,
So that's where this strategy comes from. What are your thoughts on it, Frank?
um, I don't know. I never really thought too much about that. I do like to do trading, but honestly, I don't consider the value to me too much as long as I have enough. So maybe that's similar.
Makes sense. What do you think, Mikey? Is this viable?
I don't know. I mean, I think I'm not necessarily no sure about the whole being viewed as a victim thing, especially like if you were to if you were Frank and you did this, nobody would view Frank as a victim because everybody knows that Frank always plays passive and always does the things that are going to hurt him as long as he has enough. Like, so Frank can't claim victim or subconsciously claim victim in this if he were to do this because everybody would know why he was doing it. I think the only way that this would be viable is if you had never played passive before, or maybe you have but aren't well known for playing passive.
Okay,
Hmm.
those are good points. Perhaps another way we could reword it is let's consider false trading for a moment. Is it the actual false trade that is often viewed as aggressive, or is it the attempt to make a false trade? Because so take for example, uh, someone offers me a false trade, and I call him out on it and refuse it. I call him on his bluff. Uh, is that player still viewed as aggressive, or is he viewed as more aggressive by me accepting the false trade and falling for it?
Well, I would say the intention. I just generally in life, the intention is the thing that matters the most. So if you intended to harm that, or what am I talking about? I only got 3 hours of sleep last night, everybody. So if I don't make sense, that's why. Went to bed at 4:30. Anyway, so if you intentionally, if somebody intentionally tried to make a false trade, like, well, the intent behind it was to make the false trade. So I would say that would be considered aggressive. Like if you accidentally, but obviously people don't necessarily know if you accidentally made a false trade unless it was like really stupid or something. Uh, but let's say hypothetically that you can tell if somebody's accidentally making a false trade or not intending to be harmful in the false trade. Um, then I would say you wouldn't be viewed as aggressive. So I suppose the intent is what's viewed as aggressive, but I still don't think I I don't like calling the passive player the victim because the passive player, like if you're Frank, everybody knows what Frank does, and so Frank is never really viewed as the victim. Now they might view the aggressive player as a being aggressive for trying to make that false trade. Um, So I think we can still label the aggressive player or the person who make the false trade as aggressive, and I suppose you could say it's viable. This strategy is viable if you say the person who made the false trade is aggressive, but not necessarily. I don't agree with saying that the passive player who accepts it is the victim.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, like I said, as the passive player, you would never want to make anyone. You never want to convince anyone that you were a victim because if you claim you're a victim, that's usually some other intentions there. Because there's
Yeah.
either players will be annoyed that you're claiming victim status and will target you more, or some other interactions that are not viable. Um, but a slight counter-argument to that, to describe what I meant by the passive player being the victim. Oftentimes, the neutral players will take advantage of an aggressive player by
Yep.
declaring the passive players to be the victim of their aggressive strategy. The passive players being viewed as more virtuous, uh,
Mm-hmm.
will everyone will side with the neutral player in that judgment and will
Yep.
thereby target the aggressive player. So there is a question of uh, is the accepting of a false trade viable in that the aggressive player will be viewed as more aggressive because he succeeded in the false trade and now has more economic value.
Hmm. That's an interesting question because if you just had said that the pass or aggressive player would be viewed as more aggressive because he succeeded, I would have said Don't think so. But when you added because he has more economic value, I could see that. That makes sense.
Hmm. Yes, so there is potential here. This is a very untested strategy. I've only known Tyler to do it once, and he might have been bluffing. I presume he did it because he was playing passive, and I presume he actually realized the false trade and he did accept it, which was very interesting. But who knows? There's potential here for it to be viable. I wouldn't necessarily attempt it in anything less than a five-player game.
Yeah. Try it in a
Hmm.
two-player game. I want to see what happens.
Yeah, try it in a two-player game. Purposefully accept every false trade you get. Yes, the passivity meta is. I usually always say it applies in 4 to 8 player games. But this one, maybe you need that fifth player. Maybe.
Hmm.
Hard to say. Not tested enough. Anything else we want to say on this blessed are the poor strategy before we move on to the next attrition strategy, which I'm really excited about.
Blessed should have an accent over the E at the end.
Very true.
Hmm.
Okay, moving on here. This is a strategy that Frank and I have been experimenting with recently. And that is the eternal debt strategy. It's an attrition strategy in which a player trades away their future possessions. So, for example, the instance where I traded Mikey the next 120 Kabbalah dollar in full set games. Oh, excuse me for one moment. Someone's trying to call me on Steam. That's on the
Yeah.
recording now.
Too
Ring,
many
ring,
apps.
ring, ring. Okay. Very professional.
We didn't hear anything, so that's good.
Yeah, so I heard it.
Yeah.
So therefore they heard it. Okay. Anyways, where was this thing? Oh yeah, the example I have is when we were playing a starter set game, Mikey and I and one other friend, and I traded for Hikaru, and I traded $120 in the future, which was in the full set game. So the idea is if you trade away all your future possessions, you can get decent value now. Something important like a carrot that has been prophesied to win. uh, or, something else really relevant. Maybe you're trading away future possessions for something in real life, like being shotgun while on a road trip.
Or other thing.
Yeah.
That's a fun one. Frank traded me 10 carrots, was it, to be shotgun on the
Yep.
Perkins
10
run?
carrots.
McDonald's run? Yeah. So there are benefits for this strategy in real life. But let's just consider an end game for a second. Is debt helpful to the passive strategy is the question. Because passive players do want to be economically in a bad position, as we discovered from being kind to your opponents, and players who are economically higher were more likely to get targeted. So is it viable to trade away some amount of future dollar that you draw so that the player you're trading all that dollar to is more likely to be targeted and you're less likely to be targeted? What do you think, Frank?
I don't look at it so much as the targeting part, but I just like the getting an initial value out of it, just to just by getting rid of things in the future that I probably don't need. Like the carrots that I traded away were for a full set game where we start out with like 10 carrots anyway. So I was just starting off with less, but enough carrots that I think to be able to still do something. So I thought it was a pretty good trade.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Mikey?
I don't know. I kind of liked it when I got 120 Kabbalah dollar right away at the next game. Well, and then
Yeah,
not
it was
right away.
amusing.
I mean, I didn't have to do much for it. Um, I don't even remember. Well, I don't remember who we were playing with when you offered me that trade.
It was, or maybe I don't remember either. I can't remember if it was the time we were playing with David or if it was another time.
Not that anybody cares because nobody knows who we're talking about, but ooh, David should listen to our podcast. I'll have to
Yeah,
get
send him
him
a
on.
link. There you
Uh,
go.
David, if you listen to this episode, you're in it. Congratulations. Um, um,
Does he win the Swiffer?
well, he's going to college next semester, so maybe he'll use it. He could use a Swiffer. There we
There
go.
you go. Okay.
Um, what was, oh, I don't know. Trading for all. I don't know. Trading away future possessions isn't a bad idea. I guess I've never really thought of it as a strictly passive strat. um, I guess I've never thought of it as being a passive strat. I just always thought of it as being, you want something right now, and so then you say, okay, you give me this, I'll give you the next $20 that I get or something like that. Like that's a fair trade, and I don't know. I've always thought of it as being more of a neutral strategy, honestly.
In some sense, it is. Depending on how you actually use it,
Yep.
because you could use it within the context of I'm trading you future possessions for something now, and that something now
Yep.
could be within neutral context, but a few turns in the future when you're actually trading away the debt that you're paying off, you're probably playing under a passive context, at least in some cases. In the scenarios we've been using it, experimenting with recently, it's mostly been under the passive context. But with a lot of strategies, you can utilize them within different contexts. You could use trade away future possessions within a neutral
Yep.
context. Um, Notice that with this strategy, I placed it under the attrition category, so the idea is purposefully ruining your economy. So within the context of purposefully ruining your economy and trading away future possessions, it would be passive, but you could
Yep.
use the same idea of trading away future possessions outside of passive,
Yep.
for sure. It just we wouldn't put that under eternal debt. That would just be non-eternal debt.
Yep.
Just standard debt. Yeah, it's a very. I'm really excited about this strategy whenever I play passive, or when I'm playing aggressive passive. When I was playing Kinder Protection Services a lot, Dala was more or less a liability. So what
Yep.
I would do is I would trade future Dala for something that's less of a liability. Maybe I'd trade future Dala for future carrots, or future Dala for future bunnies, or it's just give away future Dala just to make it look like I'm being nice.
Hmm.
So that's more what this is referring to, and it is pretty effective from what I've seen so far. It's difficult to calculate the relative value of future possessions, because obviously we can say a bunny right now that's worth 10. How much is a bunny worth 5 turns from now? 10, but that 10 isn't paid off until later, so how much is the tempo worth that I lost, more or less? How do we value a tempo? That's difficult to answer.
Yep.
A passive player would not value a tempo because they want to play passive. An aggressive player highly values tempo. But aggressive player
Hmm.
might also highly value a bunny in the future because all their bunnies are likely to die soon. It becomes there's some very interesting interactions with the eternal debt strategy, and I think it's a really consistent passive strategy. It's
Hmm.
really not conditional. You can do this at any point. If you're in need of something really badly, you just say, "I'll give you $50 later." Just
Yep.
offer a excessively generous trade that they're never going to refuse, and you can get whatever you want, more or less, as long as
Hmm.
there's any relevant amount of neutral or even neutral aggressive. Passive and neutral, of course, would work as well. Anything within the realm of neutral or passive, they will trade with you for these future possessions because they know you're not going to Nigerian prince them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes, Eternal Debt is a strategy that I'm really excited for. I highly recommend for anyone who wants to try out passive strategy, just because it's completely consistent. You can do it at any point. You can just trade away your future possessions. You could even do it within the context of I usually do it within the context of future games, so the next $120 in future games. You could do it within the context of the next $20 that I draw this game. And if you
Hmm.
don't draw the $20 this game, well then their debt is never paid, and they don't mind so much because it was random luck of the draw anyways. Is there anything else we want to say about eternal debt before we move on here to a very common passive strategy? Okay, so next strategy here, and we're getting about halfway through the attrition strategies here. Like I said, that's where most passive strategy falls under, is this idea of ruining your own economy. So here we have what I call penance. That's where a player attacks his own possessions. So very often, targeting your own bunnies with weapons because they deserve it. And you've been too aggressive this game, you have to kill your own bunnies because you need to pay for
Hmm.
your crimes of being aggressive. What do you think, Mikey?
Absolutely.
I think it works. I do that sometimes. You know, actually, it's a pretty good strategy, and you can use it even if you're not solely playing passive, especially if you're in the context where there's a very big aggressive player that's kind of lording over everyone else. And so you have like the nuclear warhead or something like that. You know, you sacrifice yourself for the greater good. I suppose that could be called. Oh, never. I'm not going to that anyway. Um,
Mm,
but like attacking your own possessions for just because they deserve it. It's a good way to throw people off. And ultimately, like if you're doing like the kinder protective services or whatever kind of strategy where you just really want kinder bunnies and you have some other bunnies, just kill them for fun. Those you don't need those ones. Or if you're going for like a 1-1-1 strategy, that works too.
Yeah.
I think it's
Just,
viable.
hmm hmm what do you think, Frank?
well, I think it's. I just generally target my bunnies anyway with like low level weapons because targeting myself, no, everyone's more likely, well, less likely to target me. But also, targeting a triplet or something of my own makes it more reasonable. Being like, I don't actually want this triplet, so if I fail, people are still less likely to target it because I've already done so. But that's generally not what I think of. I target mine anyway, but I can see how it's viable for that.
hmm Very true, very true. Yeah, it's a very common strategy. It was very common within our group for a while there, where maybe you have three bunnies and everyone else has two bunnies, and you're like, I have too many bunnies. I'm going to start being targeted if I'm not careful. So you start targeting your own,
Yeah.
and regardless of whether or not you succeed on rolling for those weapons, usually the players will target you less because your bunnies have already been attacked, so you're going to be attacked less in a neutral group, which makes this a very good strategy against neutral. An aggressive player would often see this strategy and think, oh, that's great, I have an opportunity to kill my opponent's last bunny that they haven't killed themselves yet. But who knows? The aggressive does tend to counter passive, but right now we're looking at passive, so where were they going with that? I was going somewhere. Oh yeah.
Hmm.
They can't kill your bunnies if you don't have any.
There you go.
So just don't have
Yeah.
bunnies. If you kill all of your own bunnies, your opponents can't kill your bunnies. And sounds like a joke, and it is, but there's some truth to it. Where if you're targeting your own bunnies, and all of a sudden you have less bunnies, you are very, very much less likely to be targeted by most opponents. At least in larger groups. The aggressive player, even the aggressive players will see the players with more bunnies as a higher threat. So therefore they should wipe out those players because that's to the best of their advantage. They're not likely to target you with the one bunny. This strategy is also used, as Mikey mentioned, within Kinder Protection Services, which is aggressive passive, so we'll be talking about that one a whole lot more a few episodes from now. But yes, this is a part of that, where just recently I was playing a 3-player game with Frank, and I was using Kinder Protection Services, and as soon as I realized that Frank was becoming aware that I was getting too much value from my triplets and such, I traded them all away. And I left only my Kinder Bunnies, only the weak ones. I traded everything else away. That's more so the alms from the poor, but killing the bunnies would have been the same effect, except in some ways better. Because if I'm killing my own bunnies, it looks like I'm doing everyone a favor, even though I'm actually giving my opponents less value by not giving them away instead, which is a very interesting
it's actually
social interaction. If I kill my bunny, everyone is thankful for it. If I give away my bunny, only one player is thankful for it. That one player is probably more thankful, but I'd rather have all of the players be thankful. Is there anything else we want to say on penance before we move on here?
Nope.
Sounds like Mikey had a joke, but he's holding it back. Yes, we must be forgiven, absolved of our sins of aggressive play, therefore we must have penance.
There you go.
Something like that. Okay. Next one on the list here is perhaps the most counterintuitive one that we're going to be talking about today. That is the strategy I like to call the last shall be first. It is an attrition strategy in which the player purposefully loses the game. So before I explain that, Frank, what are your thoughts on that idea?
I don't know. I haven't directly seen it. I've never really tried for it directly. I mean, I make myself have less, but I never choose to have nothing and lose. Certainly harder in this game compared to a game like Magic where you can directly lose the game.
What are your thoughts on Mikey before I explain this one further?
I don't think it makes any sense. Why in the world would you ever want to lose the game on purpose? You just don't play the game then. If you don't want to win,
Sort of.
don't play.
That's what it would seem like at first. I completely agree. But the idea here, and purposefully loses the game, is a bit misleading because typically we'll hybrid this strategy a little bit. And it'll be more so going for things like the 1-1-1 challenge, where you're only going to try to win with one carrot. So you're purposely putting yourself in a losing position is where it more likely lands under. But usually that's more or less can be translated to losing the game. There's the very rare exception, 1 in 54 chance in full sets, that you'll win in that scenario. But the question is, how on earth is this relevant? And the answer is, at least in theory, is that because Killer Bunnies is a social game, games cannot be isolated from each other. If you play one game today and one game tomorrow, the outcomes of today might affect the outcomes of tomorrow. You know, if Mikey wins 5 games today because we played 5 games and we're crazy, and then we play a game tomorrow, Mikey's on a 5-game winning streak, we're likely to target Mikey. It's just the way it is.
Yeah.
If you're on a winning streak, you're likely to be targeted. If you're on a losing streak, you're likely not to be targeted. So that's the idea here with the last shall be first, is you're playing the long game, where if you get a losing streak, you're likely to win the next game. Just by status of you're not likely to be targeted. Of course, it completely depends on how you actually accomplish that losing streak. Perhaps you've been playing far too aggressively, and people have been targeting you because of that. Cough, Luke.
Yeah.
What? Who said that? But if you were to start playing passively for a game, everyone's going to be nice to you. Maybe even a few players are purposefully trying to kingmake you because you're on that losing streak and they just want you to win for the memes. this is the strategy that I am most afraid of, to break Luke's losing streak. Because if he started using it and using it correctly and started playing passive, several players might want to just king make him and make him win. It's just how it is. If you're on a losing streak, players will in general be nice to you. Maybe not aggressive players, but other players. So in this strategy, you're planning on future games, which is a weird thought. You're losing games now to win games later. Why not just win the games now?
Good question.
Perhaps the answer lies in the explanation of reputation-based strategies versus knowledge-based strategies. Uh, there are several strategies that require certain knowledge, and you can just start playing them. For example, let me think of one that we talked about last episode. The Just War strategy. If you have the proper knowledge to understand this player is being aggressive, so I need to recruit a few people to team up with him, to team up against him. It just requires knowledge of the game, and there isn't any former reputation things that need to happen for that strategy to happen, at least for the most part. However, this strategy, the last shall be first, is completely rooted in reputation-based strategies, where if I have the reputation of losing the game often, I will be able to correctly utilize the strategy in the future to justify me winning. So if I lose 3 games now, and somewhat purposefully, or maybe I won a game by accident because I only had 1 carrot, in the future maybe I can justify playing slightly more aggressively than I normally would be allowed to and win 5 games. It's a very simplified example, but you can see where the idea is coming from. Where putting yourself in disadvantageous positions now can give you a reputation to put yourself in advantageous positions later. And perhaps you can lengthen that amount of time based on how you actually use it.
You know, this would be a good strategy if you, like, you could call it, what is it called now? I can't even remember. Oh, the last shall be first. You could also call this, like, I don't know. It makes me think of some maniacal, evil genius who's not necessarily maybe a genius, but he's got this big grudge against this person. So what he does is he sets it up so he plays a game with this. He plays Killer Bunnies with the same people every week, and or every day, or however we want to do this. So he intentionally creates a losing streak with the intention of, at a set time, another person who perhaps he has a grudge against, or maybe that other person was really good. That there's a set time where that other person is coming to play. So if you create yourself an intentional losing streak without the other people knowing, then people can, what did you call it? King them or whatever?
King making, yeah.
King making. They can king make you, and you can win against the guy you don't like.
And it'll be celebrated because you're the underdog.
Yes.
Yeah, that this whole strategy is rooted in underdog philosophy, where if you're a player who's known to have fewer carrots at the end, players will celebrate your victories if you have more carrots at the end in future games. So that's a question of how long can you drag out those winning streaks versus how long do you need to play losing streaks. In that sense, this reputation-based strategy is almost like a passive currency, where if I'm passive last shall be first for 3 games, does that get me to the 5 games for playing neutral aggressive and having more carrots at the end? You're using passive strategy as a currency for future games in some sense.
Hmm.
Is there anything else we want to say on the last shall be first before we move on here? So now moving
Silence
on.
is the best way to notify you that we do not want to say anything else.
That works. Better than smoke signals.
There we go.
Dark outside, so I won't be able to see them.
Mm,
Okay, moving on here. Less counterintuitive one. I like to call it trash tier, and Frank's well known for this one. It's an attrition in which the player spends dollar on inefficient objects. So the notorious example that Frank always does in Remix and Full Set is he buys the pink pawn or double pink in the case of full sets, which everyone knows the pink is
absolutely.
the least valuable pawn currently in full sets as of recording this, which is right before the release of London. It will still remain the worst pawn after the release of London. Who knows after that state? So you're spending money on worthless objects. Maybe you're just buying cabbages. Who knows? You're buying something, and it's pretty much worthless. So the idea is Dala is very flexible, and therefore you could be considered a threat for having a large amount of Dala, and that's scary. So if you spend your money on something irrelevant that nobody's going to even think about because it's so irrelevant, such as the pink pawn, then you're strictly less of a threat. You have limited your options and you've given yourself bad options. Now perhaps those bad options will sometimes work out for you, sometimes the pink rerolls are nice, but strictly speaking,
Hmm.
they're not going to help out as much as other things you could buy. But will they help out more? Plus the amount of value you're gaining from not being a target for having your dollar, is that combined worth more than the amount of value you'd gain from buying the black pawn, for example? What do you think, Frank?
Well, I just like getting the pink pawns because that's just what I do at this point. I've just gotten a reputation for it, and it also gives me a reason to trade for people's money early on in order to say, hey, I need to make sure I get this pink pawn, and if anyone else ever gets the pink pawn, then that's a reason for them to be targeted at that point.
Hmm.
And also in the full set, getting both the pink and the white to become another pink is preventing someone from getting the white to get another color pawn as well. And if later in the game, if I just so happen to be getting pink bunnies and accidentally getting a triplet or something, then that's cool, I guess. But really, just do it because that's what I do, and it does show that I am using my money on less useful objects.
Yeah, that's some very good points you had there, where these less useful or inefficient objects will often have fringe benefits that are typically ignored, such as getting a triplet on pink from one pink bunny. In full set, that's often ignored because triplets are easy to get anyway, as everyone has triplets. So you can
Yeah,
justify the use of pink triplet. Denying the white pawn is huge because, in full set, it's notorious to get double black is spooky, double red is spooky, double red's especially going to be spooky once London comes out. Double blue is economically spooky, same with double green. Lots of spooky things can happen in full set with the potential of double pawns. Creating triplets. Double pink is not seen as a threat. So all of a sudden you have
yeah,
spent $10, and now that $10 is no longer a threat. You have two pink pawns, everyone's going to ignore those, and you're actually gaining some benefit from them by denying the threats from other people and providing your own threats that people are likely to ignore, like the pink triplet.
yeah. The
Um,
thing I find real interesting is that in every game I've played, I've been the only one to get the white pawn. I
Very
only
true.
ever get the double pink. And I've never seen anyone get the white pawn as long as I'm there.
That's a very good point as well. Uh, with the reputation that you gain from trash tier, if you're consistent on what you're buying, it will often be viewed by the group as aggressive to deny the passive player of their trash tier. And oftentimes players will donate Dala for the trash tier cause.
Yeah.
It's very, very interesting scenario. So what are your thoughts, Mikey?
Well, what are my thoughts? Good question. I mean, I you brought up some good points. Um, I guess the only time that I would really spend my dollar on something inefficient was literally pretty much before the memes, which is, you know, Frank that's kind of what Frank does. I mean, he does it because that's what he does.
Hmm.
And so like
Yeah.
the reasons for doing this are they're just kind of they aren't good reasons, they're just reasons generally. Um like you could say, I'm going to buy the pink pawn because my dog's favorite color is pink. Like that's a reason. It's not a good reason, but it's a reason. And like so I mean, I guess it's a good passive strat because then people are like, "Oh, that person's not going to be a threat to me. What are they going to do with the pink pawn generally?" So, I don't know. I think it's viable. There aren't any like real good reasons to do it, but it's a viable strategy. Like, you can do it and survive.
Very good point on bringing up that often passive strategies are done within the context of for the memes. That's
Yeah.
usually the justification
Yeah.
given, when in reality, although the passive strategies are quite fun and are meme worthy, they are quite viable when portrayed under that context. Because if you're just doing memes throughout the whole game, nobody's going to consider you a threat. Nobody's going to be targeting you. You might even have more carrots at the end than everyone else. It's very often in passive viable groups that the player who's been doing everything quote unquote for the memes ends up with more carrots.
Yep.
And it's not luck based. It's very intentional. That player has not been targeted this whole game. No one dares target them, otherwise the neutral players will jump on the opportunity to declare that player aggressive. And no one's really doing anything about it. The passive players just getting away with things, even though they're not actually doing anything to get away with. They're just memeing. It's spooky. When our group at Tabletop Club started realizing it was a primarily neutral group, and then all of a sudden the passive strategy was one by one, players switched to the passive strategy because they saw how viable it was. Because all of a sudden,
Hmm.
neutral players are not going to target the passive player. It's just the way it is. If someone's targeting a passive player, they are immediately declared aggressive in a primarily neutral group. So once people start realizing that, Frank's getting more carrots than everyone else. Frank's doing well. He's doing things for the memes. They start doing things for the memes. And all of a sudden, everyone's playing passive. That's how you get into the passive meta, where you have a
Hmm.
primarily neutral group because the neutral group transitioned from a primarily aggressive group. I'm obviously oversimplifying things, but just for the sake of demonstration, it does occur where the passive strategy becomes viable just because of its status of meme worthy, and therefore no one
Hmm.
punishes a passive player, even if they are winning. Anything else we want to say on
Yeah.
trash tier before we move on to the final attrition strategy?
Nope.
Okay. So the last one I have here, I call turning the other cheek. It's obviously the a few of these are biblical references. Turning the other cheek is inspired by Clarissa's playstyle, another passive player in our group, and she will often, when a player is thinking about where to place a weapon, she will say, "Pick me, pick me." So, turn the other cheek is an attrition in which the player suggests an opponent target him again after just recently targeting him. So, someone's just played a weapon on you, and you decide, I want you to play another weapon on me. And if they do, great, they look aggressive. If they don't, great, you weren't targeted and you're probably not going to be targeted later. What do you think, Frank?
Uh, I do this primarily only when I feel like I have too many bunnies because I don't want that many bunnies. But if I have like one bunny, I don't really care much for it. But beyond maybe targeting myself. But uh,
very good point. It relates directly to the penance strategy, where if you do have too many bunnies, this
Yeah.
is a common way to start eliminating some before you actually start being considered a threat. What are your thoughts, Mikey?
Um, I always think it's interesting when um, Clarissa does this. I think I've done it a couple times. It's very interesting when you're the one gonna play a weapon and somebody says, pick me, pick me. Generally, I don't pick them. I think it could be kind of a reverse psychology thing. Um, but what's really interesting is when you have multiple people saying pick me at the same time. What do you do then?
you,
You can target yourself.
I've seen at that point where the passive players trying to use the strategy will start bribing the opponent to pick them.
Oh dear.
Oh,
and say
yeah.
and say, I'll give you $2 to play this weapon on me. It's like, what's going on? Wait a minute, that meme's gone too far.
Yeah.
But good luck finding another player that's ever going to target that person after they do something like that. They just completely ruin their economy by having bribing an opponent to play a weapon on them. They ruin
Uh-huh.
their economy. They're not going to be targeted for the rest of the game, essentially, if it's a primarily neutral group.
Yep.
And therefore they can get away with pretty much whatever they want, as long as they don't start transitioning to something like freight train, which is a very obvious aggressive strategy. Something
Yeah.
like carrot acceleration is much more viable transition from that point, if you so choose, or you could just continue playing passive and gain reputation, because reputation is valuable.
Hmm.
Anything else we want to say before we move on to uh, one of the most interesting ones on the list, and one discovered by Frank, whisk cycling. Okay, moving on to whisk cycling. So this one was discovered by Frank in a three-player, primarily passive game. There was the three of us playing, and neither Mikey nor I could justify using aggressive strategy or neutral strategy because the other would call him out on it.
Hmm.
And Frank was playing passive because he was playing passive at the time. So Frank discovered this strategy, whisk cycling, which is an economic strategy in which the player continuously buys back level 1 weapons from Roonies in order to justify the use of high tempo. So the idea here is, as a passive player, you can justify the use of a triplet and a rank and other such things, so playing 2 or 3 cards per turn, or even more in some cases, by continuously buying back the kitchen whisk or some other level 1 weapons. And every turn, you're playing 3 turns, and every 3 cards is a level 1 weapon. And maybe you're even playing the level 1 weapon on yourself. You probably are, because you're doing penance strategy
Yeah,
along
probably.
with it. So all of a sudden, your turns, nobody is threatened by your use of triplet and rank. In fact, you're threatening yourself by spending $3 a turn, maybe even from a red gleeful, because now you can justify that. And you're playing weapons on yourself, which at some point you can just buy back the bunnies that you kill. So you
Hmm.
create this engine of card playing where we can compare the benefits of the freight train strategy of aggressive, where high tempo is good. High tempo is also good in passive using whisk cycling because you can justify it and you can draw cards. Drawing cards is good because you draw money. And it
Hmm.
is extremely difficult for a neutral player to be able to justify a passive player doing this in any context. During that game, I had been playing the aggressive passive Kinder Protection Services, which is a very fragile reputation-based strategy, and I could not find a way I could justify targeting Frank at any point during that game without ruining my reputation.
Oh, yeah.
So it just was not viable. I couldn't do anything about it, and Frank won that game.
I did.
You did with Tucker.
Yeah, with Tucker. Probably the last time I saw him win.
Yeah, he's been due for a long time. That was in September.
Now, the only reason that Frank was able to do this, however, is because he stole like almost $200 from me.
No, it was 80. Like, yeah, I did.
Yes, which actually goes directly back to the Eternal Debt. This was the same game that I owed Mikey the $120. And because of the status of Mikey having this $120 for free, I was able to convince Frank to play Bunny and Clyde, which stole all of Mikey's money.
It was awful.
Yeah, I would have just thrown it away unless he hadn't told me to.
Had
So
Mikey
it's all
not
your
ha-
fault, man.
It was, and that was very intentional. Had Mikey not had that $120 that I gave him based from Eternal Debt, Frank probably would not have played it and probably would not have won that game within reason, or at least would have had much fewer carrots.
I'm
I
holding a
think the
grudge now.
interesting thing I think the interesting thing was I was just going to discard that card. I was just doing a lot of discarding since I'm playing passive. But usually when I'm discarding cards, I'll at least ask, "Hey, does anyone want this played?" And then that somewhat justifies that as well, branching off the topic
Yeah,
completely.
yeah, very, very true. That's an excellent strategy that you use, Frank. That I usually put under passive neutral, and that's if you have a card that you really don't want to play because you're playing a passive context. It is common for you to suggest asking opponents if they would like it played somewhere, and maybe they'll even bribe you to do so. Maybe they won't. Maybe they just give you a suggestion. Falls under
Yeah.
a strategy that we'll discuss more in a future episode. But yes, whisk cycling is a very interesting one because I think, at least in the majority of the community, buying back weapons is viewed as very inefficient. And I think it's ironic that the first viable use of buying back weapons was found under the passive context.
Hmm.
Yeah, I found it interesting too. I was just like, "Oh, I can cycle a card for $1? That's nice." I think that's the only way I could think of weapon buying to be efficient.
Yeah, because buying defense cards is just strictly more efficient in pretty much every case. So it becomes difficult
Yeah.
for weapons to be viable unless the low weapons emporium is out, in which case they'll launch immediately and it's terrifying.
Hmm.
So it's very, very interesting that whisk cycling works so well. And it's a completely psychological thing because one could argue that the passive player could just be using his triplet to discard 3 cards, and
Mm-hmm.
that should be the same. The difference is opponents psychologically are less likely to target a passive player who is instead spending the $3 to buy back 3 level 1 weapons, at which point every other player knows that the passive player will never be a threat at any point, and they're consistently targeting themselves in most cases.
Hmm.
So it creates a scenario where it's very difficult to justify targeting them, and there's not much that can be done about it. You have an
And
opponent.
also,
Go ahead.
and, and and also it helps to justify me actually using the turns to cycle, because otherwise I would just skip all the extra turns I got as a passive player.
Exactly.
But since I could buy back the level 1 weapons and use those to cycle, I could actually justify using my turn.
hmm In some ways, it's even more or it's even viewed as more passive than just skipping the turns, which
Yeah.
objectively skipping the turns should be viewed as more passive. But by completely dedicating your turns into exclusively playing level 1 weapons, it has reached optimal meme status where skipping turns you still feel threatening because we still don't know what you have. All of a sudden we know what you have. We know exactly what you're going to do each turn, and there's really no reason to target you for it, even though you're getting relevant benefits from drawing all the dollar each turn. The strategy pays for itself on average.
Yeah.
Yes, this is definitely If you're in a primarily passive or probably a primarily neutral would be more common group, I highly recommend testing out the viability of this strategy. This is more so a knowledge-based strategy than a reputation-based strategy, so you don't even need to work at it before you start trying it. If you start buying back level 1 weapons, players will instantly start targeting you less, pretty much, in a neutral group. At least my predictions are that. Anything else we want to say about whisk cycling before we move on to the last strategy we'll be discussing here? Okay, so the last strategy I want to discuss here is what I call the gambler strategy. So obviously there are a lot of, I don't want to say luck-based, but there are luck-based mechanics in Killer Bunnies, even though they are controllable. The gambler is a weird passive strategy in which the player takes risks against expected value in hopes that the low chance success will be celebrated rather than retaliated. So the idea here is succeeding on a high value card is often portrayed as aggressive. So if I gain a ton of dollar from having Carrot Top Royale and I had all these rerolls, so it was almost guaranteed, I gained all this value, it's viewed as aggressive. But what if I didn't have the rerolls and I decided to go for Carrot Top Royale and included the optional red even though it was expected value very much against my favor? What if I go for that strategy? Of course, I could lose at that point, and at which point I'm definitely playing passive because I just completely destroyed my economy. So now I'm just playing penance strategy. But if I succeed, what's going to happen? The idea is if you succeed at a really low chance roll that was against expected value, and you probably could have avoided it, opponents are not likely to target you based on that economic status gained. Because you weren't supposed to, it wasn't meant to be. You just got it because of the memes. You get credit for having the guts to include the optional red gamble without a reroll. What are your thoughts, Frank?
Yeah, I guess. I don't often do the gambling ones myself, although I think there was that one time where someone convinced me that I should do the optional red,
Yeah, that
and
was
I think
me.
I lost that one.
That was me, and I made you regret it.
I'm noticing the gambler problem spreading.
What do you think, Mikey?
I think it's viable. I'm not going to target anybody for trying to, you know, roll something that's pretty much against all odds that they would win. If they get it, like I'm not like that's pretty cool. It's like that you had a very small chance of actually winning that or whatever. So yeah, this is definitely a viable strategy.
I've been using it a bit recently, specifically in remix with the card Triple or Trouble. Triple or Trouble is the one that you roll the 3 dice, and the green die has to be highest. And in that case, you triple your money you gambled. Otherwise, you lose all your money. So 1 in 3 chance, approximately, that you get to triple your money. So expected value is probably not in your favor. However, of course, you could get the pawns and increase your odds so that you can make the card in your favor, and then players will treat the card as the threat it's meant to be treated as. But what if you instead try it without rerolls and gamble all of your money? If you succeed that, which I have a couple of times recently, it doesn't seem to be retaliated in my experience. All of a sudden, I've tripled my $20. I have $60 in remix. That's insane. But no one's targeting me for it because I worked so hard, quote unquote, worked so hard by giving myself an excellent opportunity to lose that $20.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone kind of just ignores it. Memes happened. Let's celebrate it, is the idea. Rather than, memes happened. How dare you be so lucky? which can happen in some groups. So this one is definitely one that is group dependent, is not consistent. In certain groups, the memes will be celebrated. You got a low chance. Let's celebrate. We can check it off the bucket list. Probably not in the case of Triple or Trouble, since that one's more common. But in
Mhm.
something like an Atlas Shrugged with a relevant amount of players without rerolls, if you succeed in that, sure, the one player is probably going to be mad at you, whoever's winning the most, but maybe it'll be celebrated for the memes. Who knows? Same sort of idea there, although that one you're not actually gambling anything, so maybe not. Is there anything else we want to say about the gambler before we close here?
No?
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for listening. Hopefully, we have convinced some of the viability of passive strategy in a primarily neutral group, or at least as a semi counter to some neutral strategies. Thank you, Frank, for joining as a guest today. If anyone would like to be a potential future guest, feel free to contact me. As we've established, the best way to contact me is through carrier pigeon, but I also accept Discord messages or on Facebook. Or if you have any potential topic suggestions, feel free to send those in as well. Although the next 3 episodes are already planned out for the hybrid strategies, which is very exciting discussions there.
Hmm.
Very interesting strategies that we'll be discussing. We've already been hinting at kinder protection services quite a bit, since that's
Mhm.
the one that I was famous for a few months' time. uh, Anything you'd like to say, Mikey?
Jeff bless.
Jeff Bless.